Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I would like to welcome you to From the Editor's Desk, a podcast where myself and Kyle Brasseur, editor-in-chief at Compliance Week, unpack some of the top stories which have or will appear in Compliance Week each month. We look at the top compliance stories, talk some sports, and generally try to solve the world's problems. Some of the issues we take up in this episode of From the Editor's Desk include the SAP Foreign Corrupt Practices Enforcement Action. We take a look at a very interesting data privacy issue coming out of France and the French Data Protection Agency CNIL or CNIL involving Amazon with a data issue that may not offend many Americans. We take a look at DOJ pronouncements and, of course, talk some sports with the retirement of Bill Belichick and the NFL playoffs. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox with another episode of From the Editor's Desk, a podcast where we unpack some of the top stories which have or will appear in Compliance Week, look at other top compliance stories, talk some sports, and generally try to solve the world's problems. I'm your co-host, Tom Fox.
And I'm Kyle Brasseur, editor-in-chief with Compliance Week, thrilled to be back with Tom for our first episode of the new year. Tom said we'll talk a little compliance, we'll talk a little sports, and we'll talk a little bit of everything else.
So, Kyle, we're going to start with stories in January, but I have to start with the FCPA came out swinging in early January. The DOJ and SEC announced a massive FCPA enforcement action against SAP. You guys covered it extensively. Maybe we could start there. What did you see or what perhaps interested you? And then what are some of the other stories you've looked at in January?
Yeah, Tom, I think the SAP one really definitely jumps out the most. And one of the things that sort of caught my eye is at the end of the day, you can focus in on the what went wrong and everything like that. But I feel like the DOJ is really making a concerted effort to highlight what went right in some of these scenarios. And this case in particular really jumped out. If you're looking at the bottom of the DOJ's press release, when they're talking about the remedial efforts and the cooperation that SAP offered, there were 18 different items total. And that just screams off the page to me as an indication that the regulators are really trying to make a point to say, here's what companies are doing right. So that way more and more companies are following that line. I know we've heard it so many times from DOJ officials that if you're looking for guidance, look at our enforcement actions. That is the best guidance you're going to receive. And it seems like they're really making a concerted effort to have these enforcement actions be the examples companies may need to understand what companies are doing to earn cooperation credit. Again, it's a reactive approach to some extent. At this point, if you're looking at cooperation credit, that only comes with a penalty. But at the same time, it really does give you a good idea as to know, okay, if I'm negotiating with the DOJ, then this is what I can expect them to be looking for me to do in order to get a break on my penalty. And even the same goes with the SEC. They're definitely making it a point to highlight remediation and cooperation as well. Both regulators have been calling out when companies are using data analytics. This case was really, I thought was really interesting. One of the aspects of it is that SAP had imaged some employees' phones. We've heard a lot of talk from the DOJ about new expectations regarding the retention of off-channel communications. And so now we have a sort of an example of what that might actually mean. So I think these aspects are really illuminative because it just gives you an idea as to say, okay, this is what the expectations are or the new expectations are under this kind of regime of we're really promoting voluntary self-disclosure. We're really promoting cooperation credit. They're giving out a lot of carrots and the stick is going to be a little bit harsher as a result.
I think you're spot on, Kyle. And I was stunned. Stunned probably is not the right word, but I thought the DOJ clearly communicated what it wants to see going forward, and it did that in the settlement documents. And you're absolutely right as to these. I'm going to try and think about putting together something along the lines of from ABB to Albemarle to now SAP to really show how the DOJ has communicated that. I thought it was very significant. Worldwide bribery scheme, multiple countries, as bad as it gets, yet a really fabulous result for SAP. Anything else caught you or your team's eye in January?
No, and I think all three of those enforcement actions you mentioned, Tom, are a great one. And one thing that did catch our eye was a webcast that you moderated in the middle of the month with representatives from Albemarle and ABB on their FCPA settlements, and specifically on the data analytics aspect. So again, we have to focus on, you can't just dwell on the negative of it. Listen, the FCPA was violated, and we get that, and we understand that. And that seems to be, based on the allegations, fairly straightforward. But there's so much to learn from what companies are doing in those scenarios. And so I think it's really great to give a platform to people from those companies when they're willing to share it, what they're willing to share, and what they can discuss, to be able to say, yeah, this is what worked for us. Because there's just so much that can be learned from that for the rest of the companies out there, if they end up in that situation. Of course, the goal is to not end up in that situation, but as we often know, these things are sometimes just out of your control. That definitely jumped out to us, and kudos to you and the team at Kona for putting that on. In terms of other actions this month, I thought it was a surprisingly busy January on the enforcement front. Two other big cases that stuck out to me was the SEC's fine of JP Morgan for violations of their whistleblower protection rule. This is something that the SEC is really cracking down on. This fine was a record under that rule, and it broke the previous record, which was only in September of last year against D.E. Shaw. It's very apparent that the SEC is cracking down on what it believes are violations of its whistleblower protection rules and settlement agreements, in contracts, and termination agreements, whatever it might be. I think it's a wake-up call for companies to check through those agreements and make sure that the language is 100% clear that if someone is exiting the company or exiting the relationship with the company, they do have that right to go to government agencies as a whistleblower, as those rules require. So I thought that case really stuck out because, again, it just puts an exclamation point on the fact that this is something the SEC is really cracking down on. And then another case, and this one just happened recently, is actually out of France, where an Amazon unit was fined for violating the General Data Protection Regulation with regard to employee surveillance. It's a really fascinating case. Basically, the French regulator CNIL took exception to how much Amazon was using data to track its employees' productivity. They really felt that it was excessive, and I think it really begs a lot of questions as to where is the line with employee surveillance. That's something we're still feeling out in this new data privacy regime, is how far is too far with measuring employee productivity. And I think this case is, to me, again, is completely fascinating. I would imagine Amazon will appeal it, and I'll be really keen to pay attention to how that goes, because this is really, it's a matter of perception here. And in this case, the French regulator felt, okay, you're measuring all this data and then you're analyzing it over the period of a month, when in reality, it would probably be just as efficient for you to do this on a weekly basis. And so therefore, the data retention here is excessive. Again, that's a matter of opinion to some extent. And in this case, the opinion resulted in a $35 million fine. Again, I think it's really interesting to see how these things are playing out. The French regulator has always been aggressive with the GDPR. They don't care too much about the cross-border implications. They'll just make sure that they're finding companies that they feel are wronging French residents. And again, those are two cases that I really feel like I'm interested to see where they go from here.
Kyle, on the JP Morgan matter, in addition to everything you said, which of course I heartily agree with, this was not a former JP Morgan employee, current employee, but customers. So I was really intrigued that the group of getting protection from retaliation, here a pretaliation, has expanded out. So I think that's going to be significant. And then the CNIL or CNIL, their fine, I thought, Kyle, it really spoke to almost a basic difference in philosophy around work management and, frankly, time and motion studies in the United States and in Europe. I don't think we would think twice in the United States about companies that were watching, surveilling employees to see how quickly they did a task or how long they took breaks. I've been subject to that, and I never thought twice about it. My father was a professor in industrial engineering, and you know what he studied? Time and motion. We've been doing that for 100 years in America. And yet in Europe, they not only found that offensive, they found the storage of that data offensive. Where here in the United States, we would say, of course, we're going to store it because we're going to look at it for long-term trends to see if we could do something more efficiently or not.
They're getting worked up over it too, Tom. They feel very strongly about it. No, I agree. And I think this is the type of thing where we've talked a lot about how the U.S. is replicating the GDPR with California and some of these other states putting through other laws. But that's where the rub sort of exists in that again, in the US, we don't quite perceive privacy violations the same way they do in the EU. So even if we're replicating the GDPR, in these type of cases where it really comes down to opinion to some extent, and again, the viewpoint of the regulator here and the committee at the regulator, they felt it was excessive. That's where the penalty really comes down on. I don't think we would quite see this in the US, but this is something that US companies might have to confront if we get to a point where there is that federal legislation. Or if California, once they really start flexing their muscles with the CCPA, we've only really seen it enforced once so far with Sephora. But once we see more and more cases come through and we start to get that better understanding on where the lines are drawn, that might be something US-based companies have to confront, because right now no one's batting an eye at it and everyone's probably doing it. Like you said, you've been through similar things. I've been through similar things. But once the precedent is set, that's when you have this, okay, where are we actually at on this? So that's why I think this case is so fascinating. That's why I think if it goes to appeal, it'll be interesting to see what, however far it goes up the chain, what the ruling ends up being, because it could really establish a sort of baseline where how far is too far with employee surveillance. And if that ends up being a low-hanging fruit for regulators who are really trying to push data privacy and have that be part of their agenda, then that's something a lot of companies are going to have to take a step back and confront.
Can I ask you to maybe tease us with a hint or two of some stories that you're looking at that you may write in February, or anything else that's on your mind for down the road a little bit?
Yeah, again, we had a few high-profile enforcement actions in January. We'll be continuing to follow those through February. Our typical approach is we try to get to the news right immediately, just like every other news outlet, but then we take that time to take that step back, look through the documents, and really get into the weeds and speak with some subject matter experts to really pull out the relevant details. We expect to be working through that over the course of the next month. Some of the other stuff we have coming up on the radar, our next case study is right around the corner. We'll be looking to publish that at the end of February, or early March. It's going to be based on basically a giant case study on know your customer and anti-money laundering compliance. That's a topic we haven't quite delved into a case study on yet. So we're really looking forward to being able to roll that out. It's about 3/4 of the way done at this point. So we'll spend the month of February dotting the I's and crossing the T's and getting that ready to go. So we're looking forward to getting all that out the door. And then we're also ramping up as our national conference is right around the corner. It's early April this year. That's a much earlier start for us. We're about 9 weeks out at this point. So we're really going to be starting to roll up on that and make sure that people have a really clear picture as to some of the exciting stuff that we have on the agenda there. So it's exciting for us to have this a little bit earlier in the year and be able to jump into it.
I'm excited as well. Compliance Week has moved it to April. I know you're gearing up, and there's been some releases of speakers. Hopefully we'll be able to get a little more information out as we come along. We're doing a podcast speaker series again this year, so we're going to highlight some of the upcoming speakers. And I know you're talking to several of the speakers, so I'm looking forward to your visits with them and what we might be able to glean from those as well.
Yeah, and we also do have a couple of new sort of events that we have in the mix as well. So something we're going to be doing in February is we're putting on, it's going to be a virtual roundtable on basically exactly what we started this podcast talking about, just recent lessons from the DOJ, from their enforcement actions, from their policy changes, and really how compliance officers should be viewing it. That's something where we've assembled a panel. We'll have Daniel Kahn, who's former DOJ. He used to be the chief of the FCPA unit in the fraud section. And then we'll also have Steve Naughton, who's a Compliance Week Advisory Board member, Director of Regulatory Compliance Studies at Loyola, and a former CICO at PepsiCo and Kimberly-Clark. And then we'll also have a gentleman from Case IQ as well. So it's going to be a really great roundtable. We're going to spend the first hour doing a Q&A with Daniel on his perspectives as someone recently former DOJ. And then we're going to spend that second hour just really breaking down what the takeaways need to be for compliance officers. So really looking forward to getting that out in February, and we'll be holding it live and then also writing off of it, because I think that there's going to be a lot of really practical takeaways from it. And then one other thing, a little more down the road, is in June, we're looking to bring back our financial services conference. So this is one that we did for the first time in 2020. We ended up having to shift it virtual because of COVID. So we did it in March 2020. And so we're looking to resurrect that. That's going to be taking place in New York and really focusing in on financial crime and regulatory compliance for the financial services sector. Cool to be doing some new stuff and really getting into some of these things that are really high profile at this point in time.
I happen to know that the gentleman from Case IQ is Jacob Fichtner, so yes. I will give him a shout out. Yeah, some really exciting things. The roundtable, that's one thing I'm really looking forward to. Your panelists, I think, are top notch. And anytime Dan Kahn speaks, my policy is to listen. because he's a great guy, but more importantly, he's almost an educator. And literally every time he talks about the FCPA, I learned something. But the whole panel is great. Steve and Jacob are equally knowledgeable, so I'm greatly looking forward to that. Let's turn to the world of sports. And I'm going to start local, and then I'm going to expand out a little bit nationally. I'm going to start with Bill Belichick. You and I have talked extensively on this podcast about our joint love of baseball, your coverage of the Boston Red Sox, what baseball means to Boston and greater New England, what it means to you and I. But I'd like to turn to those kind of same types of questions to Bill Belichick. And do the Patriots have the same level of passion in Boston or even New England that the Red Sox did or do? And how do you feel like Belichick, how is he thought of in New England? I think his legacy from the NFL is, I can't say anything but the greatest coach of all time with his number of Super Bowls. But what does he really mean to where you're from?
Yeah, for like most sports cities, Boston has a level of recency bias. We will judge based on how you've been performing of late. There was always that soft spot for the Red Sox in all the years that they were lovable losers. But for the most part, the success of the Patriots as a brand and Bruins and Celtics are really based off the success on the field. And right now, the Patriots' success, even coming off a couple of down seasons, it's still sky high. That we're still all just so used to them being consistent winners. And so Patriots are probably the biggest draw in town just because of how long they had that successful run and just the fact that football's as popular as it is in America. But I think it's one of those things where a lot of people around here, they enjoyed Belichick for the quirks that the rest of the country never really found amusing or whatever it might be. I think it's once you get used to it, once you experience it every single day, and I've been in many of those press conferences, at first it's really uncomfortable to sit there and have that back and forth of a reporter trying to crack the nut and just not getting anything at all. But then once you get used to it, you start to see the humor in it. Maybe it's not quite intentional, but you start to just appreciate it for what it is. And I think fans around here are used to that. And that's the way they view Belichick as. This is what he does. And this is the way he is. And I think there was a lot of respect for that, just as it is. It's a little bit blue collar in some senses. And that tends to be the attitude around here. I know a lot of people are disappointed to see him go. I think if you look at all the different things that went wrong last season, it's not really all on Belichick. I think there's a lot of different things that didn't work out. But the one thing you can't deny is that the Patriots have a talent shortage, and that's a result of the draft. And he's the one who's calling those shots and is the one who's leading player personnel. That's where it really becomes hard to deny that, okay, a change needs to be made here. But I think at the end of the day, it's really a matter of sometimes you just got to shake it up and do things fresh. And that's what the Patriots felt they needed to do. It makes it easier that they switched to someone like Gerard Mayo, who was a beloved player when he was here and a big guy in the community and a really someone that's very easy to root for. But it's tough shoes to fill, and it's something that Mayo's going to have to face constantly is, okay, what if Belichick was still here? How would he be doing this or whatever it might be, especially as he remains out on the market, which is the case at this point in time.
So now let's turn to a little bit broader. And yesterday we had the two NFL championship games, NFC and AFC conference championship games. And so my question is as follows. Did we have a collapse for the ages, meaning one of the top four greatest collapses in 55 years? Did we have another Baltimore Ravens / Lamar choke? Or did we learn that the Lions were one face mask away from winning and never bet against Patrick Mahomes?
Yeah, that's a lot of different scenarios there. I think it really comes down to it always reinforces the notion that when it comes to the playoffs, it's the team that makes the least mistakes that tends to win the most. Or at least I felt like that played up the most in the Chiefs-Ravens game. The Ravens just made way too many mistakes in that game. A lot of it was really costly, really dumb penalties that are completely avoidable. But you also had the 2 turnovers in the red zone. And when you look at the margin of victory only being 7 points, that's the game right there. So at the end of the day, the Chiefs, they didn't play their best. Mahomes can put up 35 on a normal day, so only putting up 17. But still, they didn't make many mistakes, and that's why they won that game. So I think it's hard to call it a choke or one of the greatest collapses or anything like that. It just didn't look like smart football. It didn't look like Harbaugh football. It's just something, I don't know if it was the Chiefs of it that got in their head or they were just too focused on whatever it was, but it just wasn't the same Ravens team we saw all year. And that's got to be the most frustrating part of it all, is that you play so well all year and you play with composure, and then in the game where it matters most, just not in sync and not on that same page. And then on the NFC side, I think to me, the 49ers go as Brock Purdy goes. And in that first half, as a quarterback, he was not quite so sharp, and that allowed the Lions to really go grab a hold of the momentum. But once Purdy turned it on in the second half, the 49ers, they're basically unstoppable when he's playing well. And so that's what I think we ended up seeing. I think in terms of talent, the 49ers are probably the most talented team in the league. And once you give them that window, they'll just start to run it up. It's disappointing, I think, from the aspect of the Lions built out that big lead. There's so much riding on them as the one original team that hasn't never made a Super Bowl. They came so close. But at the end of the day, the talent of the 49ers was just too tough to keep up with. And they'll tell you too, we had that lead. We should have held on to it. And their offense wasn't quite able to build on it.
Being a supporter of one of the other three greatest collapses of all time, the Houston Oilers up 35-3 in 1993 against Buffalo, losing 38-35, I certainly felt that pain. But in that situation, it was the Oilers' really last run, and they broke the team up after that. And here we have a third-year head coach, Dan Campbell, taking Detroit not to the playoffs for the first time, but to the NFC Championship. And I think the basis is there for a pretty good run. So I think there should be some positivity and hope from Detroit. I think they may be in a different division next year with what I saw from the Packers and maybe even the Bears coming back a little bit. I don't feel quite as badly for the Lions as I did for the Oilers way back when. And perhaps we can even shout out to your Patriots for their Super Bowl.
Yeah,
I have to tell this story when it was, I think it was 35 when the Falcons were up by about 30 points. My 88-year-old mother calls me and says, I don't think they can come back. And I said, Mom, it's Tom Brady.
You can't deny the talent.
Let's go
it can
watch
back.
one more series. And she says, okay. And sure enough, greatest comeback ever. So, yeah, I'm really looking forward to a good Super Bowl, and perhaps we can chat about this next time. Well, Kyle, thanks again for visiting with me. I am Tom Fox.
I'm Kyle Brasseur. Thanks for having me, Tom. Always a pleasure.
This is Tom Fox again. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of From the Editor's Desk. We've linked to Compliance Week in the show notes, so I hope you'll check out not only the entire site, but also the survey from the mind of the CCO. It's got some great information in there, whether you're a CCO or a compliance professional. From the Editor's Desk is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. If you've enjoyed this episode, I hope you'll subscribe, rate, and review wherever great podcasts are listened to.